Okay, so lastly, we need to add some shading and highlights to really make our character look a bit more three-dimensional and less flat. So that's the kind of style that I go for. Um, so it's actually a really similar process to the colouring layers that we did, but we are not using colour layers. So let me show you. Let's start with shading the skin. So we're going to repeat this process for each of the different colour layers that we did. Starting with the skin. Now I want this layer to be above all of the skin colour layers, which is actually just the skin and the cheek colour, because I didn't add any other extra colours on that skin layer. So I'm going to select the cheeks layer just to make sure this new layer goes above it. And in the new fill or adjustment layer, I am going to choose, instead of solid color this time, we are going to choose hue saturation. Now what this does is opens up our properties box for the hue saturation. And what this will do, right, we don't want to do this, but what you could do is drag the hue layer, which would, as you see, change the hue or the color on that skin layer. We don't actually want to do that. We want to leave the color as it is. What we want to change is the lightness. So we are adding shadow, so not to the whole layer, but just so we can choose our color. We want to bring that lightness down a bit. Now in a minute we are going to attach this to the skin layer to make it an adjustment layer so it doesn't affect the whole illustration, but let's just get the color right. So we want to go down a bit for our shadow, and then what we want to do is take the saturation up a little bit just so it's not so grey, so that there's a little bit more brightness in our shadows. So now that we have the color we want for the shadows, we can attach that layer, remember holding down the Option or Alt key and hovering between the hue saturation layer we just created and whatever the top layer is on your colors layer. So it's cheeks on our skin layer. So, and then click to connect those. Now obviously her whole face is now in shadow. We don't want that. So let's Command A to select our whole canvas. Let's click on that layer mask, white layer mask there on our hue adjustment layer, and make sure that white is our foreground color, and then delete to just take that away. For the shading, we actually want to color this in with a soft white brush, which a soft round brush, sorry, not white brush, which I already have selected from when we did the eyes. So I am good to go. If I look in here, you can see I've got the soft round brush. It's actually probably around the right size. Make it a little bit bigger. The hardness is 0. I'm going to take the opacity right down to about 20 because you really want to be subtle with your shading. So what we want to do is think about a light source. Even though this is an illustration, it isn't real. In order to make to do the shadows and make things look 3D, you want to think about where the light's coming from, so you know where the shadows will be. So really it's just a case of choosing a side of the character for the shadows to be on. So say I say that the light source is coming from the top right. I haven't put a background in yet, so it doesn't matter where the light source is coming from, but if you do add a background to your illustration, obviously you want to keep that consistent. So say you've got trees with shadows on, etc, etc, you want to make sure the shadows are in the right place depending on where you've chosen your light source to be. And if you are showing a sun in the sky or something, you want to make sure that that's where the light source is coming from, but that's irrelevant at the moment. So I'm just going to say that the light source is the top right, therefore the shadows will be kind of lower left. So I'm going to start over here by just literally softly drawing around the bottom right. You can see it is really subtle. I'll do a little bit of shadow under here. I'm actually going to bring that up a tiny bit and bring the size of my brush down a tiny bit. Constantly adjust as you go, and add a little bit more shadow in here, under the hair, and inside her ear here, because there would be some shadow in there. So like I say, it's really, really subtle. Now I feel like that shadow went a bit too much into the face there, so I'm going to switch these around. So black is my foreground colour, bring up the size of the brush a bit, bring up the opacity, and I'm going to just erase around here to remove some of that shadow from her face a little bit. There we go. Now I'm much happier with that. If I come down here and actually turn that layer off, because it is a subtle effect, you can see much clearer how the shadow looks. I'm going to switch those back and I'm going to add a tiny bit more shadow just to the top of her ear there. I also feel like my shadow looks a bit dark and a bit grey. So what I can do is double click on the thumbnail for that hue saturation layer, and I can bring up the saturation a little bit more to add a little bit more colour into the shadow. And I can also bring up the lightness a bit so it's not quite so dark. And just fiddle with those until you get a colour for the shadow that you are happy with. And that's all there is to it. That's how you create the shadows. So we will literally go through each layer and add shadows onto the layer in the same way. So what we're going to do next is actually, let's rename that layer shadow, just so we can keep track, because we're getting so many layers now, and just so we can keep track of what's what. Now we're going to do the same thing again, but this time we're going to create a highlight layer. So click on the create new fill or adjustment layer. Once again, choose hue saturation. You can experiment with these fill and adjustment layers, by the way. You can add gradient layers, vibrancy layers, all sorts of things. Like, it's amazing what you can do. I love Photoshop so much. Right, so this time, instead of bringing the lightness down, we're going to bring the lightness right up and the saturation right up. You can see I've made her face kind of whitish now, so I'm going to Command A to select it. Oh, I'm going to select the layer mask on that layer, and I'm going to delete to get rid of that. I am going to attach that layer to the one below, and I'm going to call it light. And now I'm going to take my brush and I'm just going to paint on the opposite side. So there's not actually much to do on the face here because there's not going to be much light hitting it. But I will just literally sweep over on that opposite side of her cheek and her chin, just a little bit to add a bit of a highlight, and maybe to the top of her ear. I'll turn it off and on to show you. It's not much, it's just added a little bit, in fact a bit too much. So I'm going to just switch that to the black and just remove a little bit here. There we go. You can't see it much on this layer, so I'm going to repeat the process on the dress, hat and tights layer of creating shadow and a light, so you can see a bit more the effect of that, and then we'll do it. Well, let's just do it on all the layers. So I go to the very top layer in my dress, hat and tights layer. I click new fill or adjustment layer and I choose hue saturation. My properties window pops up and I want to pull down the lightness, pull up the saturation, which makes everything look awful, but we know we're going to get rid of that in a second. Let's attach that layer to the dress, hat, tights blue layer. So now you can see what colour the shadows will be, but we don't want the whole layer to be that colour. So let's Command A to select everything, click on that layer mask, and then make sure that white is our foreground colour, and delete to get rid of that. Then with our soft round brush still selected, it's on 68% opacity, so I'm going to take it down again a little bit to 37. Let's see how we go. I'm just going to, again, on the left side, paint and build up the layer of the shadow. Now there would be shadow under where the cape is, because that cape will cast some shadow. So you can see now we start to add some depth by adding these shadows in, also on her legs, because those legs and tights are part of the same layer. And there would be a shadow underneath where that dress is hitting her legs. So I'm just going to go all around, add a little bit of shadow to the left hand side and to under where anything would be casting a shadow. A bit of a line here because there would be some creases in her dress, and the hat. So we'll do a little bit on the left side of the hat and just around the front of the hat really, because that's where the shadow will be, and underneath here on the left. So there we go, we have some shadow on the dress, and let's add some highlights. Again, we new filler adjustment layer, Hue saturation, we go to our properties window, and this time we go up with the light so it's almost white, and we go up with the saturation so it's right near the top. Connect that layer to the one below. Command A to select our canvas. Click on that layer mask and delete to get rid of the light. And then with the soft white brush, I like to bring the opacity up a little bit when I'm doing the light. Just like paint round the top side a little bit to add some light where the light would be hitting the hat and the dress. Oh, and let's not forget the glove. I'll add a bit of shadow to the glove. Let me go back to the shadow layer. Add a little bit of shadow to the glove. Then go back to the light layer. A little bit light on the edge of those tights, on those legs. Okay, so let's rename those layers. Shadows and light. If I turn that shade layer off and on, you'll see there on the blue, all of her blue areas. You'll see how that really has added some depth, and the light layer just added a little something to the edge there. I think you will actually see it more on the purple layer, so let's do that. Let's do the layer with the cape and boots and whatnot. So again, we go to the upmost, the top layer that we have attached to the cape and boots. New hue saturation layer, we go to properties. We're starting with the shadow, so let's bring that down, bring the saturation up. Let's attach it to the layer below, rename it shadow. Command A to select our canvas, make sure we have the layer mask selected and delete. And then with our soft white brush on this purple layer, we can paint in some shadows, just a little bit there, a little bit around there. And down on her boots, you'd get shadow. You get a shadow right in the middle there, in between the boots as well. Get a bit of shade around there, and around the front. And the bottom. And then we want to add a light layer, highlight layer. So again, hue saturation layer, let's attach it. Let's call it light. On our properties window, we want to make that nice and light, bring up that saturation a lot. It can be really fun to bring up the saturation and bring some nice bright colours in there. Delete that and then use our brush to paint it in just around the edges there. Go, bring some nice brightness in on the edge of the boots and the cape. And I think that's starting to look awesome. I'm really happy with that. So, wow, we're getting there now. So I am just going to repeat that process on the fur layer. In fact, let's just do that now, because all we want to do is add a little bit of shade on the fur layer, because it's kind of white. It doesn't really need much for highlight. So we will bring the saturation up, because remember we've got those colours on top of our white on the fur layer, so it'll be cool to bring the saturation up for those. Let's attach it, let's call it shadow. You should know the process by now, I've done it a few times. Make sure we've got that selected, and then just go around the fur, adding in that shade. There we go, our fur's starting to look real now. It might be a bit too dark, so I'm going to might bring that a touch lighter in a minute, and a bit more saturation to pop those colours that we added in there. So I'm just painting around the bottom left of all that fur, just to really give it that 3D effect. And can't forget the fur on her hat. There we go. How is that looking? I feel it's a bit dark, so I'm going to double click on this layer and bring the lightness up a tad. There we go. And I'm going to bring the saturation up a tad as well, because I think it's really fun to bring out those colours. I'm much happier with that now. So I'm going to repeat that process on which layers have I missed. So her top, the pink top, and her hair and earrings and bell. And then I'm going to colour in my other characters and the lamp and the dog, and give the picture a background, and I will be back to show you